We begin with breaking news on the national inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. CBC News has obtained a copy of the Commission's final report ahead of its official release on Monday, and it is damning, calling the women's disappearance a Canadian genocide. The CBC's Jorge Barrera got the report and joins us now live from Ottawa. So Jorge, how significant is it that the Commission is using the term genocide?
Well, Andrew, it's very significant. The word genocide is incredibly weighty given its historical associations. And the inquiry actually goes further than the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which released a report in 2015, into the history of Indian residential schools. And that report concluded that that was evidence of a cultural genocide. But this inquiry does not qualify the word genocide in their report. And I think that may be, surprising to many Canadians because genocide is not something that is generally associated with Canada. But the report goes to some lengths to sort of marshal its arguments to show why it came to this conclusion. And it cites research going back to about 1973 about genocide in Canada and the continent. And it sort of tracks this research to current times. The report also refers to an op-ed that was written in 2013 by former Assembly of First Nations National Chief Phil Fontaine and Bernie Farber, the former Executive Director of the Canadian Jewish Congress, where they penned an op-ed arguing that the definition of genocide does apply to what happened to Indigenous people in Canada. And I'll just read you a little bit from the report itself about why it says it came to this conclusion. And I'm quoting here. This genocide has been empowered by colonial structures, evidenced notably by the Indian Act, the 60 Scoop, residential schools, and breaches of human and Inuit, Métis, and First Nations rights, leading directly to the current increased rates of violence, death, and suicide in Indigenous populations. Genocide is the sum of the social practices, assumptions, and actions detailed within this report. The National Inquiry's findings support characterizing these acts, including violence against Indigenous women and girls, as genocide. Now, the report says that the inquiry will be releasing a supplemental report specifically on this issue in the coming days, and it will be posted on their website.
And Jorge, this was a wrenching process for everyone affected. How does the report reflect that?
Well, this is a massive report, over 1,200 pages. We have over 200 recommendations, which it labels calls for justice. And these calls for justice range from a wide, it covers a wide variety of institutions, government, media, and each of these have their own subsections of sub-recommendations. And all the way through this report are sprinkled the families and the families of the missing and the murdered and their stories. And if you think about these stories, each one of these stories is its own unique tragedy with its own unique pain. And to actually try to weave together all these different stories and to come up with an overarching narrative is no easy task. And I think that's why they came up with such a massive document that covers so many things. And the only conclusion they could reach was that all these elements point to one thing, and that is genocide.
So as you've been going through these 1,200 pages, what else stands out to you?
Well, one of the things that jumped out at me was that the report says that it could not come to a number of murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls. Now, there's been a number that has been cited in the past. It's 4,000, that there's 4,000 murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls from across the country going back some decades. But the inquiry report says no, we actually can't come to a conclusive number on that. Now, some of its calls for justice are directed at the Canadian government, and also provincial and territorial governments, and they're calling for all these governments to come together and come up with an action plan to deal with all their calls for justice and to implement them. They're also calling on Ottawa to create some sort of independent reporting mechanism that will provide Parliament with an update on the progress made on their calls for justice. There's also a call to change the criminal code to classify homicides related to intimate partner relationships as first-degree murder. So they want a criminal code change to that. But I think what's interesting is that this report and the inquiry is actually reaching out directly to Canadians, and it has calls for actions, speaking to them and saying, we want you to learn about the true history of Canada and the true Indigenous history. We also want you to call out racism and violence against Indigenous women and girls wherever you see it. And it also says that we want you to read this report in full and learn from it. Now, this report will be handed over to Prime Minister Justin Trudeau on Monday at a ceremony at the Museum of History in Gatineau. And Gatineau is just across the Ottawa River from Parliament Hill. Andrew?
Jorge, thank you. The CBC's Jorge Barrera reporting live from Ottawa. On Monday, we will have extensive special coverage on the report of the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls. There will be a ceremony in the morning, and the report's commissioners will speak at 12 Eastern. You can watch it all here on CBC News Network. And later this hour, I'll speak to an advocate for missing and murdered Indigenous women. That's at 3:30 p.m. Eastern Time. As Jorge mentioned, this report has been 2.5 years in the making, and it had many bumps along the way. Here to take us through some of the challenges this national inquiry faced is our Megan Batchelor. So Megan, this report was originally supposed to be submitted November of last year.
Yeah, that's right. It was set out with that task originally back in December 2015. That's when this all started, when Prime Minister Justin Trudeau made the announcement that there would be a national inquiry into missing and murdered women and girls in Canada. At the time, it started in September of 2016, and at that time, it was tasked with issuing a final report by the end of 2018 with a budget of $53.8 million. We know that that timeline was not met, and that budget also was not met. But over the course of those 2.5 years, commissioners heard a number of different testimony from different people. Here's a look at the highlights of what the commissioners were tasked with over the course of those 2.5 years. So they spoke with over 2,000 participants, and that includes experts as well as family members of those who had gone missing or were murdered in Canada. There were 24 total hearings across the country in 15 different communities. And we know that last year they had asked for a 2-year extension. That was denied. They wanted to do more research, but that was denied. Instead, they were given a 6-month extension, and so that's where we are today. Over the course of those 2.5 years, though, the inquiry was fraught with resignations from several top-level officials, commissioners, and executive directors over the course of the 2.5 years. At least one expressed concern with the structure of the inquiry, the direction of it. The commission itself, though, was pretty tight-lipped when it came to those resignations as to why these people were leaving it. Some staff said that the organization was overwhelmed. They didn't have a clear direction on this. And one lawyer who quit was accused the government of interfering with it. But here we are today. So this will be the next part in this timeline, this report that's now being released. And it will be interesting to see what comes of it in the future, Andrew.
And so take us through some of the key cases that were integral to the creation of this inquiry.
Well, there had been calls for this inquiry for decades, really, in Canada, and probably one of the most notable cases where the calls had been the loudest was out of the Robert Pickton case here in BC. We know that he had been convicted of the murder of 6 women. He had been charged with 20 others. Most of those women came from Vancouver's downtown east side. Most of those were Indigenous as well. There was a hearing into that, and that inquiry kind of first put the bug in people's ears that there should be a national inquiry into missing and murdered women and the state of that across the country, most particularly Indigenous women and how they were going missing at the time as well. We also know the story of Tina Fontaine in Winnipeg. That's most recently spurred calls for this inquiry. Her body was found in the Red River, and after she had gone missing in that city. And of course, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission also initially called for an inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women after they looked into the impact of residential schools on survivors in Canada. And that's just a few of the notable cases. There's been numerous cases since then of missing and murdered Indigenous women in Canada, and we know that each time we heard about those definitely came with the call for an inquiry as well. And it will be interesting now to see how government agencies and those nonprofits that worked on those cases will be responding to this report.
All right, Megan, thank you. For reaction, we have reached Lorelei Williams. She is an advocate for missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. She herself has had family members go missing. Lorelei Williams joins me now from Vancouver. So Lorelei, the report says Indigenous women and girls have been the victims of a Canadian genocide. What do you make of that conclusion?
I'm grateful that that's being pointed out because that's the truth. It is a genocide against our Indigenous women and girls and our people since contact. So,
why is it a genocide in your view?
You know, you have the government who made it a law to throw our kids into the residential schools. And then that's the genocide against our people, right? And, you know, the police had to throw these kids into the residential schools. They were trying to take the Indian out of the child. You have the priests and all of them running the school system. And all of this was for our land. And, you know, what better way to get at our land than to target our Indigenous women and girls? So our women are being murdered at a high rate since then. And like I said, for the land, they were throwing our kids into the residential school system, starving them, beating them, using them for medical experiments. That's a genocide against our people, right? And our women are the targets of that. And predators know that as well. So that's why they target us.
The report is the culmination of 2.5 years of work. Does the report findings go far enough, in your opinion?
I actually haven't even seen the report yet. I haven't even been able to look at it yet.
Because it was leaked to us. We obtained a copy of it. So yeah, you're just getting some of the highlights that we've been able to point out. Yeah. So. Without looking at it, I'm hoping that for sure that the recommendations will be implemented. I hope there's some accountability, some public accountability for that to start happening as soon as possible, because we need action right now, because our women are going missing and being murdered at a high rate right now still to this day. Tell us about your personal story about your aunt and your cousin.
So my aunt has been missing since 1978, Lorelei Williams, and there was a lot of flaws that happened in that case as well. One of them being that she was technically not even listed as reported missing until 2004, even though my family tried so many times to report her, and they never took it seriously. So this is the police system against us. Right? And then you have my cousin Tanya Holick, who went missing in 1996, and her DNA was later found on Robert Picton's farm. And that's another police system against us, because when my family tried to report her missing, they were faced with racist and judgmental VPD civilian clerk, Sandy Cameron, who was saying rude remarks, racist remarks, and, you know, saying stuff like, oh, she's just a drug addict, nobody will care about her, she's just partying in Mexico, things like that. You know, she even closed my cousin's file 1 month after my aunt opened it. My aunt had to fight really hard to get it reopened, you know, and so this is not only happening to my family, but all the families across Canada. So, yeah.
One of the recommendations in the report is that all Canadians call out racism wherever, whenever they see it, when it is impacting Indigenous women and girls. Call it out. Is that a help?
Oh yeah, for sure. I feel like all of Canada doesn't understand the racism that we go through in everyday life. It just happens all the time. So yeah, calling it out will definitely help us. Because a lot of people think Canada's perfect, and Canada is not perfect. So, you know, I've had to deal with stuff in the school system, just recently as well, for my daughter, for myself in university. So calling out racism will definitely help our Indigenous women and girls.
What do you say to the Canadians who are watching and listening and who are hearing those words, Canadian genocide? Those are not words that I think we have heard before in terms of a genocide against the people on this land, against Indigenous people on this land. What do you say to them?
I say know that, understand it, acknowledge it, and learn our history, learn the history of Canada. You know, Canada is only 151 years old. Is that the year? Sorry. But, you know, they need to learn about this because it is a genocide against our people, you know, since contact. And to know that and understand that, because this is what our people are going through, and I don't think Canadians or people around the world understand that this is a genocide against us and our missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls.
The report is being released at an official ceremony with the Prime Minister, cabinet ministers, and Indigenous leaders. What are you hoping to hear from them on Monday?
I don't think the Prime Minister is going to be there because I feel, isn't he going to be here in Vancouver? There's a world conference happening here starting June 3rd, the same day as the closing of the National Inquiry. And even just saying that, like, I feel like the Prime Minister should be at that event in Quebec, but I know I think he's going to be here in Vancouver.
But
sorry.
Wherever he is, we can try and figure that one out. But what do you want to hear from him on this? Now that this report is going to be out, now that those words, Canadian genocide, have been used?
I don't know. I don't know what I want to hear from him because I feel like anything that I've heard so far are lies. You know, like I feel like, okay, yes, Justin Trudeau gave us this national inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. However, he is letting those pipelines go in. And you know, that is another thing. That's raping Mother Earth. So those two go hand in hand, you know, and that's one of the worst things that's happening right now. That's another thing, you know, raping Mother Earth. You know, we have to live on Mother Earth. So I don't know what I want to hear from him, actually, you know. And then he was very disrespectful to Minister Jody Raybould as well. So I'm just like, do I want to hear from him? I don't think I want to hear from him, but that's how I feel about that anyways.
Lorelei, I appreciate you taking the time to talk to us. Thank you.
Thank you.
Lorelei Williams is an advocate for missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls in Vancouver.